I'm
Yeah.
going to now turn this over to Joe, and Joe will introduce Russell.
Great, thank you. And the mission statement is on the homepage of Los Altos Community Coalition.org, so you should be able to see it there. Before we get started with Russell, I make sure you mute everybody if you were talking, and lower your hands if you raise them. We have a request. We're trying to get our YouTube presence to YouTube has this silly rule where if you don't have 100 followers, you can't name your channel. So right now we have the very cryptic series of digits that looks like a Bitcoin key or something. But I just pasted the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. If you're so inclined, please take 5 seconds to click on it, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified when new videos get posted from these events, you can also click the little bell icon, and you'll get a notification from YouTube when that happens. So we started off today at 16. I hope we can get up to 30 or 40 after this meeting, and we'll keep doing that, and hope we get up to the requisite number as we start to ramp up some of the social media activities for the coalition. I'd like to introduce our first speaker to kick off the new season of Los Altos Community Coalition, our reboot, I guess we would call it. We're in for a treat today. We have Russell Hancock, who's the president and CEO of Joint Ventures Silicon Valley. And Russell is going to give us an update on the state of Silicon Valley. We'll try to save a few minutes at the end for questions. At that point, if you have an excellent question, we're probably going to only have room for 2 or 3. Please raise your virtual hand, and David will try to moderate if time allows. And without further ado, please join me in air clapping and welcoming Russell Hancock.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to your gathering. I'm really delighted to be here. It's an honor. I consider it a privilege, and it's always particularly special to be in front of people like yourselves who care about community. I salute you for that. Now, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, somebody needs to allow me to share my screen because it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, good. I'm co-host now. Here we go. I'm going to pull up some slides.
And if we have trouble, Russell, I have your slides and can bring them up, but let's see if you can get it. There we go.
Yep, there we go. No problem at all. So let's talk about it. Here we go. This is our region. That's how it looks from outer space. It's remarkable in many respects. One thing that's actually quite remarkable about it is that what you're looking at is actually the most prodigious regional economy in the history of regional economies. And I don't mean that in some grandiose or boosterish kind of way. I'm just being cold and clinical. There is no other place on the planet that has experienced this much sustained growth and expansion over such a long period of time, nor is there any other place that has showcased so much innovation and entrepreneurship and company formation. And of course, these are not ordinary companies. These are companies that have become household words, that have carved out market share on a world scale and have changed the world as we know it, and we have done it consistently across generations of technology and waves of innovation. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. What's more remarkable still is that as you look at this map, you see that it's all happening on a narrow neck of land that is surrounded on 3 sides by water and ringed by mountains, hills, and permanently protected open space. So for the most part, this is a region that's completely built out, and yet all of that prodigious activity that we're describing has taken place on this very fixed landmass. It's remarkable. It's truly extraordinary. Well, I want to talk about what this remarkable place is doing at this moment in time, and so I just want to give us a sense of how we've done through a global pandemic and where we seem to be headed. Now, I'll start by just talking about the job picture itself. When the pandemic set in, we were, of course, extremely concerned about Silicon Valley's ability to withstand. In fact, a lot of us were assuming that this might be the end of life as we know it. And it's because we were shuttering large segments of the economy. And so we battened down the hatches and we were braced for the worst. Well, guess what? In many ways, the dire scenario didn't materialize. If you look at this chart, this shows our job growth over 20 years. And you can see that we've just been fairly prodigious through that 20-year period. But we could go back, for example, to 2008, and you can see that that was when the big recession set in. We lost jobs. But then from 2009, 10, 12 onwards, we've been steadily climbing until 2020, when we introduced an artificial intervention and decided to close down a large segment of the economy. But what's remarkable is that 2 years later, we're back where we were. And this is in terms of the absolute number of jobs. And by the way, our workforce is about 1.5 million, 1.7 million. That's what the workforce is of Silicon Valley. And you can see that by the second quarter of 2021, we had already recovered all of the jobs that we lost. And in fact, we had added to it, that little light green bar is what we added to our job total, 15,000 jobs. And we actually end up ahead of where we were in the pandemic. So that's remarkable. By the way, that's most of those new jobs are in the tech sector. And we can talk about that at length if you like. But it turns out that the pandemic wasn't a crisis for tech. It turned out to be actually a bonanza for tech, because our tech companies were providing all of those essential services, platforms, architecture, and the devices that a sheltering world so badly needed. So it turned out that actually the pandemic was good news for our technology economy, and it manifests itself here in terms of the number of jobs. Here's your unemployment rate. It spiked up immediately in 2020 and through 2021. Excuse me, but we're back to where we were. We're at 2.4% unemployment. Most economists will tell you that that's the equivalent of full employment. And then the tech sector itself, it's not that it just recovered. Something extraordinary happened. It turned out to have a record-breaking performance. Even in the depths of the pandemic, our tech companies started breaking all previous records, something that was just extraordinary and the last thing that we expected. Here, for example, is market cap. Market cap, I'll remind you, is the value of all of the shares of the publicly traded companies. And when the pandemic set in, we were at about $8 trillion. Well, that market cap grew over the pandemic to 14 trillion, a number we've never seen before in Silicon Valley. So that gives you some sense of this thing. Venture capital, it's a very important indicator because it tells you so many things about where the economy seems to be headed and what people are betting on, how they feel about the future. Well, in 2021, we saw the highest number that we've ever seen in Silicon Valley, $95 billion in venture capital. That's venture funds amassed here and then spent here on Silicon Valley companies. Absolutely extraordinary. We've never seen a number like that in our entire history, including even during the dot-com craziness back in 1999. So that's amazing, absolutely amazing. And then here you can see the number of newly funded startups in the pandemic didn't slow any of that activity down. We see robust numbers of companies achieving that A round funding, that B round, even the advanced rounds of funding. We haven't seen this number of newly funded startups in a long time. So that's impressive. Angel investment has grown over the period. You may have heard of this term, unicorns. A unicorn is a company that is valued at more than $1 billion, privately held, but its value is more than $1 billion. They coined the term because unicorns were considered to be practically mythical, this very rare thing that you would hardly ever see. Well, it's come to the point where that term is really no longer apt because Silicon Valley has so many unicorns. We have actually more than 200 unicorns, and we have about 17 DECACORNS. That's $10 billion in valuations. So again, extraordinary. This is just extraordinary market performance. We thought there would be an issue with commercial development. We thought the pandemic would bring all of that screeching to a halt. And sure enough, there was a downturn in the early going, but that activity has actually returned. And it's significant to us that the major tech companies have not walked away from their leases. They're still heavily engaged in leasing activity, in property acquisition, and they're building out commercial space. That activity is still proceeding. Now, we may be coming up against some headwinds, and we can talk about that in the question period, because more lately, and I'm talking about just in the last quarter, we're seeing some stock market adjustments. And as people think about the return to work and what the workplace should look like in a hybrid environment, which seems to be becoming the new norm, there will be adjustments to what we do with our commercial space. Nevertheless, our companies are still growing, and they're still building out space, and we're still approving record amounts of non-residential development. So that gives you a sense. That gives you a sense of what's going on with our technology-heavy, technology-driven economy. Rather than missing a couple of beats, we actually just blew through all of the expectations and had record-breaking performance. Excuse me. However, if I left it at that, I would not be telling you the real story. This would be a very incomplete picture of what's actually happening in Silicon Valley. And of course, you understand that. You're on the ground. So I'm really telling you things that you already know. But I want to give you a more detailed sense of what's also going on in the economy. Here, for example, shows you what our pie chart looks like. This is our employment picture. And people wonder what segment of our tech economy is, how big a slice of our pie is the tech economy. And here's the answer. It's the red slice of the pie. So if you look at that red slice, it's about 26% of our economy. And what I mean by that is that these are people that are real bona fide techies. These are people that are working with electrons. These are people that are firing those electrons and making them dance in particular ways. And that makes up about a quarter of our economy. During the pandemic, that slice of our pie actually grew. It grew to 30%. In other words, it achieved 4 more percentage points. Now, look at the blue slice of the pie. Those are the jobs that we call jobs of place, or the technical term is community infrastructure and services. These are jobs that are not unique to Silicon Valley. You'll find them in any economy. These are jobs in retail, healthcare, education, things like that. And they make up half of our economy, fully half of our economy. And those are where we actually lost jobs. We lost them significantly. And then if you go into the greater detail, here's community infrastructure and services, and it has all of these various categories: transportation, accommodation, food services, retail, personal services. Nonprofits is a very significant part of this. And the hit that they have taken is extremely significant, and they are not yet in recovery. In fact, you could say that unemployment in these segments of our economy is approaching 30%. And excuse me, the recovery is underway, but it's not happening anywhere in the same way that it's happening in those other segments of the economy. And so this is a chart that's showing you that there are hosts of people in Silicon Valley that are looking for work, who are underemployed, underutilized, underpaid, or furloughed, and we're still waiting for the recovery to happen in those areas. Now, I want to go from there to take a look at our income picture, and we'll just do this really quickly. But this is an extraordinary chart. This chart is showing you that the average annual income in the United States is around $70,000. These are averages, right? You take all of the people, all of the money that they earn, you divide it by the number of people. In the United States, we get $70,000. That figure in Silicon Valley is $170,000. In other words, more than double the national average. That's the kind of place that we're living. Now, averages don't tell you the true picture. So I want to be very clear about that. There's a problem with averages. A place like Silicon Valley has very high earners. We are a place with 50 billionaires. We're a place with about 270,000 millionaires. We're a place where people have upwards of 350,000 people have liquid assets of $1 million or more. That's not just the value of their house, by the way, it's their liquid assets. So we're skewed because there's so many high earners. Nevertheless, this chart is telling you that there's something to this notion that Silicon Valley really is a place where you can come and pursue a path to prosperity. This shows you median household income. It's maybe a better indicator because median means that half the households are above that and half are below that. But even looking at median, you can see that we're more than double the national average in terms of household income. So that's extraordinary. But now I want to show you a chart that tells you about wealth distribution. And it's going to give you another sense of some of the gaps that have come to characterize our region. This chart, for example, excuse me, is telling you that the top 25% of earners account for 92% of the wealth. And I actually want to put that for you in English. Here's a slide in plain English. Households in the top quarter hold 92% of the wealth in Silicon Valley. That's the highest figure that you'll find anywhere in the nation. Households in the bottom half are holding less than 2% of the wealth. This is extraordinary. I'd like to show you this in terms of the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure that economists find to be really useful. It's a hypothetical. A Gini, it's a 0 to 1 scale. That's how it works. Or zero, you could call it 0 to 100. And a coefficient of 0 would mean that all of the people hold all of the wealth equally. And a coefficient of 1 or a coefficient of 100 means that one person holds all of the wealth and the other 99 people hold none of the wealth. So that's what we call a Gini coefficient. And this chart is showing you what our Gini has done. We're the green line. And since 2005, we have gone from a Gini coefficient in the 40s, in the low 40s, to a Gini coefficient in the mid 60s. In other words, a growth of 20 points on the Gini scale. That's extraordinary. By the way, economists, developmental economists who study nations will tell you that a Gini coefficient in the 60s is considered politically unstable, that those are the conditions that are ripe for revolution and other forms of revolt and uprising and mayhem. So that's the kind of place we're living in. Silicon Valley is this place with extraordinary gaps, and no other place displays those kinds of gaps. This is a chart that's showing you that fully a third of the households in Silicon Valley are not self-sufficient. We were surprised that the number was that high, but it is. And by self-sufficient, we mean that in order to subsist, these households have to receive some form of assistance, and that would be from a friend, from a church community, from a family member, or from a government program. 1/3 of the households in Silicon Valley are not self-sufficient. So that's something we wanted to point out. Now, this is a number that just astonished us when we brought this to light. That number, 44, is the percentage of Silicon Valley children who are living in homes that are not self-sufficient. We double checked this. This is really true. So I hope you're understanding exactly what I mean. Take all of the children, they're living in Silicon Valley. Excuse me, 44% of them are not living in homes that are self-sufficient. That's the size of it. Now we'll come back to that, but while all of this was happening, inflation set in for a host of reasons that we could discuss. And so the challenge of living in a high-cost place like Silicon Valley, has only increased as inflation hits record amounts. We haven't seen inflation like this at any time in our history since the 1970s. So this is a big deal. Okay, I want to talk for a moment about how we're doing on housing. I'll just be very brief on this point because I think you already understand it. Housing is really expensive. We now have the most expensive housing of any place in the nation. There are no exceptions any way that you measure it. Our median home sale price is now north of $1 million, and that's just the median. Remember, half or more than that. So that's the kind of place that we're living. Here's the percentage of first-time home buyers that can qualify for financing at their bank or financial institution. And that number has fallen to 25%. So the question is, are we doing anything about that problem? Are we adding to the housing stock so that there can be more units, so that that can alleviate the pressure on supply and address the demand? And the answer is that we're not doing very much. We last year permitted less than 6,000 units. And I want to see if I have a chart here. Yeah, here's a chart that juxtaposes job growth in the Bay Area over the past 10 years. And those are the green bars. You can see amazing job growth. It's actually about 850,000 new jobs in our region. That would be the equivalent of taking a city the size of San Francisco and just dropping that on top of our landscape. Now, the yellow bars are showing you the number of housing units that we issued in terms of permits with those same years. And you can see the gap. There's your problem. It's an extraordinary gap. We're adding the jobs, but we're not adding to our housing stock in any appreciable way. And nothing's changed that trend. So there it is. You can see the mismatch. It's about 6 to 1, 8 to 1, something like that. That's what's going on here. Okay. I want to cover two things before returning your time and allowing you to ask some questions. This year, as we looked at Silicon Valley, we decided to bring a special equity lens and try to understand our community from that standpoint as well. And we learned some interesting things. This is a chart that shows you that we're a very diverse community. We've always been very proud of that. We're actually 29% Hispanic or Latino. I'm sorry, we're actually 39% Asian. We're 29% white. We're 24% Hispanic or Latino. In other words, there's no majority population here. We're just extremely diverse. However, our neighborhoods are not diverse. Take a look at this chart. This is what we looked like in 1980. And if you're shaded in green, that means that your neighborhood is diverse. By that, we mean there is a high likelihood that your neighbor doesn't look like you. And that's what we looked like in 1980. Here's what we looked like in 1990. Here's what we looked like by 2000. Look at all of those red neighborhoods. Red means it's a high likelihood that your neighbor looks like you. And here's what we look like in 2010. Mostly red. In other words, even though we're a highly diverse region, our neighborhoods are not. We've chosen to segregate ourselves into neighborhoods of similarity. So that's an interesting finding. We've known for a long time that there are troubling disparities by race. And by that, I mean educational disparities. This chart dramatizes that. Same with our high school dropout rates. These are very sad and troubling statistics that nevertheless characterize us as a region. What we didn't understand was that there's even a wage gap when you look at it by educational attainment. And we were astonished by this. It turns out that if you are a Hispanic or Latino resident, but you're holding a bachelor's degree, you will be making 64% less than your white counterpart who also holds a bachelor's degree. We didn't see that one coming. And the same is true of our Black or African-American residents. They're making a wage that's 50% less than their white counterparts. We can't explain it, but those are the facts. I showed you this already. this is the chart showing you that we're a third of our households are not self-sufficient. But this gives you the underlying numbers. This shows you that if you are a Hispanic or Latino household, that actually 61% of those households are not sufficient. This chart also shows you that if you are a Hispanic or Latino household and you are limited in your language ability, then fully 90% of those households are not self-sufficient. And if there are children it's Latino households with children and not fully English proficient, 90% of those households are not meeting the self-sufficiency standards. And you can see how it breaks down for our Black households and other households as well. I showed you this number, 44% not self-sufficient of our children, but this is what those numbers look like. If you take that pie, 44% of those 44% of all of the children, you make a pie out of them. This chart shows you that half of those children are Latino or Hispanic children. A quarter of them are Pacific Islanders. So we have these just tremendously persistent disparities. Now, the hope has always been that tech can be a path forward. And we continue to have that hope, and our tech companies are making a sincere effort. But as of yet, we're not seeing the results. This is our population chart, 24% are Hispanic or Latino. But this is what tech looks like. These are the 20 largest tech companies, and the leadership roles are held by whites and Asians, 86% of them. And only 5% of those leadership roles are held by Hispanics or Latinos. So we still have a lot of work in front of us on that. Let's see, I'm out of time. So I'm going to end with this chart. And this is a brutal chart. It shows you that COVID itself turned out to have this injustice to it, because the people who were exposed the most to the disease turned out to be our Hispanic residents. And that's because they had to make these impossible choices, whether to work, but therefore expose themselves to the disease, or whether to not work and protect yourself from the disease, but therefore forego wages. And for the most part, these are the people working on those noble frontline essential services. And those are the jobs that had to be done in person, couldn't be done working in front of a computer screen from the safety of your home. And so what we learned is that Hispanics and Latinos were 6 times more exposed to the disease, and were dying from the disease at a level that was triple the white and Asian counterparts. So there's some pretty sad things here about our region. But I'll conclude my remarks there, because I know there are questions and people raising their hands, and I'm looking forward to a little bit of dialogue and discussion. So thank you very much, and I'm now in your good hands.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Russell. Joe, if you want to return whoops.
I see that John Cowan, for example, is raising.
Yeah. And now, Russell, I'll be glad to moderate. John Cowan, please go forward.
Thank you. A really interesting presentation. I was just struck by the inequality data and wealth data that you showed in our region. And I was thinking about how a lot of the taxes related to that, and also philanthropic contributions, kind of are paid at the state or federal level. And I was just wondering if you've looked at how that wealth kind of comes back to our region to kind of try to address some of the inequality, either through the form of state and federal taxes and what comes back to our area, or philanthropic contributions, because that seems to be an important question about addressing some of the inequality that we see in our region.
You know, there's a happy story on the philanthropic side. When the pandemic set in, Silicon Valley showed itself to be extremely generous. And within weeks, we had generated $94 million in charitable giving coming from corporations and individuals of high net worth and from the foundations themselves. All of that money went immediately to direct relief, housing, and food. So we showed ourselves to be a compassionate region and a resilient one. The tax thing, it's a good news story in the sense that California has a tax system that's based on wealth. We actually tax our high earners, and then a significant portion of the state budget is generated from capital gains and stock market. And because we're so high performing here in Silicon Valley, the state has run remarkable surpluses. In fact, it was a $76 billion surplus in the first year of the pandemic, a $96 billion surplus in the second year. This year, the governor said that he's looking at surpluses in the same amount. Now, the state and the legislature have decided that a lot of that surplus is actually going to be spent on relief, direct relief, rental assistance, housing, eviction moratoria, food assistance programs, the CalFresh, all of those. And so that's what tends to be happening with the state dollars. I'm not an expert on the federal picture. I'd have to get back to you on that.
I just wanted to point out that it's 9:30. Russell, if you're willing to keep going, for those who can stay, we'd like to keep going.
Sure, a couple more questions. Love to.
That would be great. And then just for those who might happen to have a schedule that they have to leave right now, I want to thank you for joining and mention that our next session will be June 3rd, Friday, June 3rd, same time, 8:30, starting 8:30 in the morning. And it'll be Gabe, the city manager, briefing on the state of Los Altos. So thanks. If anyone has to leave, thanks again for attending. Much appreciated. Next hand up I see is from Joe.
Yeah, I didn't see any other hands up, but Russell, lots of cities in Northern California going through their housing elements right now.
Yes.
And, we have a particular challenge in Los Altos where, we're essentially fully built out and trying to find space. So any thoughts from your travels around the Bay Area about, what we should be doing on the housing element as we spend the next 12 months or so wrapping it up?
It's difficult. Let me just stipulate that it's really difficult. I understand it. Los Altos is a community that's largely built out. The only options are parcels that are low intensity being increased to high intensity, doing that in places where it makes sense. El Camino Real is one place that you've been doing that. The other option is height. So, and of course, that goes along with intensity, I realize, but there's the way to get more people is to build units with more density and more height. And it turns out that those are the things that voters are most opposed to, especially in communities like Los Altos. And so that's going to be the rub. And there will be, I live in Palo Alto. Palo Alto's had had many of the same challenges. We've had proposals like the senior center that was going to be on El Camino Real. It was the Mayfield proposal. Seniors, for crying out loud, it wasn't generating extra car trips. These are all going to be in shuttles, and yet the people of Palo Alto rose up against it with an initiative at the ballot box. Those elected officials were dismissed at the next election. So there's strong sentiment in our communities not to add to our housing stock. And that's the thing that we're somehow going to have to address. And in a community like Los Altos, it means doing it, creating those units that are dense and have verticality in places like El Camino Real and the band. I want to call it the 500-foot band on either side of it.
Good Q&A there. I don't see any other hands up. If anyone else would like to ask a question, please do so by raising your hand.
Oh,
Nadia.
Yeah, I'm really curious as you go around the Bay Area. In our mission statement is also about civil discourse, and change is what's happening in all of our communities.
yes.
Your example in Palo Alto is just spot on here in Los Altos too.
Yeah.
So have you seen good examples of how you can have public dialogue to help people manage change? You know, there's so much not in my backyard.
Yes.
And quite frankly, it's going to happen, and it may happen incorrectly just because it gets mandated, which is the wrong answer.
Yeah.
So we're looking for better ways of communicating and having good discourse.
Boy, I agree with you completely, and I'm not aware of good examples. We need community meetings. We need meetings that are outside of the highly charged city council chambers. We need meetings besides the one where the action is actually being taken. Those meetings need to be in the form of retreats. They need to be convened by community players like my organization. We're available to do this kind of thing. They need to be richly informed by the facts. There needs to be dialogue so people can process the information. They need to be accessible. The material needs to be explained in plain English. That really needs to happen. And it needs to happen at a community level. This is a very appropriate role for foundations to be playing, certainly for business community groups like your own. I think you're exemplary in that way. We need it. There's a crying need for it.
Thanks. Any other, I was going to mention also on that, we had 3-4 years ago, a meeting about exactly how to do that, and came up with charrettes as another example. And it
Yes.
was, and we did those, and it was extremely effective with the downtown visioning and all the 45 different public forums they had on it. If there's any other questions for Russell? If not, thanks so much, Russell. This was incredibly informative, and we very much appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for attending. And we're really excited to get LACC back in gear and going, and look forward to future emails and announcements. Thanks so much to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
David, Joe, thanks very much.
Our pleasure. Thanks.